Woo! All right. So this is part 4. Last one was a minute shorter. I had to let my dog out. So, video.
In 1824, James Monroe was retiring after 2 terms as president. Andrew Jackson thought he was an excellent candidate to be the next occupant of the White House, but he was not the only one with his eye on the job. John Quincy Adams was the son of John Adams, America's second president. He had spent much...
He's also, president-wise, not fantastic, but politicians, he's probably one of the most experienced politicians that we've ever had. I don't even remember how many languages. Went all over the world. I mean, he was really good. I'll say that.
Of his childhood in Europe with his father, and was now Secretary of State. His worldview was as different from Jackson's as his upbringing.
He was a politician with imagination. He imagined an America that was much more economically developed. He imagined an America with much broader educational opportunities for everybody. He imagined an America in which the rights of Indians and black people and women were actually respected.
Treasury Secretary William...
He also came, John Adams was his father, for those who don't know. John Quincy Adams. That's who he was. John Adams was his father. First vice president and second president. And Abigail Adams was his mom. Abigail Adams does not get talked about as much. I mean, people talk about John Adams, we talk about Abigail. But she was a very strong presence in his life, in John Quincy Adams' life. And she was, I would deem her probably like a very good mother in terms of teaching him right and wrong. John Quincy also took to being what his father was. He had another brother who was drunk and died from that, but what I'm saying is his mother was a very good role model for him to have. For a lot of people back then, she would have been a very good role model for any of them.
Crawford and Speaker of the House Henry Clay were also candidates for president. As in every previous election, the candidates did not campaign, and in some states, residents did not even get to vote for president. Instead, the state legislature chose that state's members of the Electoral College.
In the early years of the Republic, voters were not called on to choose the President of the United States. Choosing the President was, quite honestly and quite deliberately, an elitist operation. The people who were thought to be the insiders in state government became the presidential electors, and they chose the president based on which set of Washington insiders they thought was the best. And the people were basically expected to accept that decision without complaint.
In an election controlled by Washington politicians, the frontiersman from Tennessee seemed certain to finish last.
When Andrew Jackson's name was first floated about as a candidate for the presidency, all kinds of leading politicians were aghast. They understood him to be a wild-eyed military chieftain, a hot-tempered individual who had executed a couple of Brits down in Florida without authority or apparent reason. And as Jefferson said, he was the most unfit man imaginable for the office of the presidency.
To counter the view that Jackson was unfit to be president, one of his advisors, John Eaton, published a series of letters that proposed an entirely new rationale for what was important in a president.
In the selection of a chief magistrate of this union, it is not necessary that we should look exclusively to the mental qualifications of a candidate. It is strength of character, a perseverance and steadiness of purpose that makes the distinguished man.
What John Eaton does in the Letters of Wyoming is simply stand on its head the conventional understanding of the qualifications of a president. The very qualities that made a candidate before, John Quincy Adams being the ideal: experience in courts of Europe, experience in diplomacy, experience as his father's secretary in various offices of government. All of this is proof of corruption, proof of insider status, proof of being out of touch with the people. Whereas Jackson's complete absence of a resume becomes his primary qualification for office.
Does any of that sound familiar? 2016. All the insiders are corrupt. Drain the swamp. The only experience that he had was they were very similar. And one of the first places Trump went to after his presidency was he went right to the Hermitage. And I know because I went there in 2017, and they said that Trump had just been there. So, yeah. He modeled himself after him, minus the duels and the killings and stuff. But he did model himself after him in a way. Had a picture of...
When the votes were counted...
Had a painting of Jackson in his Oval Office. He admired him. I did. I wasn't a fan of Jackson's presidency, as I've said before. But his life leading up to it, things he accomplished, pretty amazing.
In 1824, the Washington establishment was stunned to discover that Andrew Jackson had won both the most popular and electoral votes. But with 4 men dividing up the electoral vote, Jackson did not win a majority, and the election was thrown into the House of Representatives. Speaker of the House Henry Clay had finished last and was out of the running. But he had enough support to play kingmaker. Clay believed with all of his heart that Andrew Jackson was unfit to be president, so he threw his support to John Quincy Adams, and with it, Adams was elected president. Adams then immediately offered Clay the job of Secretary of State. Outraged Jackson supporters began railing against what they were convinced was a corrupt bargain between Washington insiders to steal the presidency from Andrew Jackson.
Doesn't look good.
One newspaper, which had endorsed Jackson, declared,
"Expired at Washington on the 9th of February, 1825, the virtue, liberty, and independence of the United States, caused by poison administered by the assassin hand of John Quincy Adams, the usurper, and Henry Clay."
What they were absolutely convinced of was that the popular will had been thwarted, the election had been stolen, Washington insiders had cooked up the whole thing, and they had to make sure it didn't happen again.
By 1828, when Andrew Jackson ran against John Quincy Adams a second time, the Jacksonians were ready to launch the first true political campaign in American history. Their strategy was driven by the fact that most states had finally given the vote to all white males. To inspire those men to get out and vote for the first time in their lives, Jackson's campaign took advantage of the latest media revolution, lithography, to flood America with lithographs of the hero of the Battle of New Orleans.
If you're going to elect the president by appealing to the people as a whole, you change the ground rules completely, because you have to win the popular vote down there at the grassroots, at the militia grounds, in the taverns, in the fairs, in the streets, all across the country. So somehow you have to be able to reach those people. You've got to fire them up.
The Jacksonians' plan was to rally average Americans around a new idea, that they should choose the President of the United States.
So they organized all kinds of popular demonstrations, rallies, conventions, assemblies of people who would get together and hurrah for Jackson. They would pass some set of resolutions, and then they would all have a barbecue, and they would all have a drink, and they would start to cheer, and pretty soon you get the sense that everybody in this precinct is for Jackson, and they'd send the results of that to the newspaper and try to publicize it as much as they could. And this was the kind of tactic that didn't require finagling behind closed doors. It could take place in the boondocks. It could happen in rural Tennessee, rural Alabama, rural New York. And this kind of stirring up popular vote and giving the people the notion that they should choose the president and not the caucus members in Washington, that revolutionized American politics. The people have not been willing to give up the choice of president ever since.
The revolutionary new style of campaigning soon made Jackson into the heavy favorite. But then his opponents discovered the skeleton inside Andrew and Rachel's closet. The man behind the mischief was a confidant of Henry Clay's, who edited a Cincinnati newspaper. He uncovered and printed the court record of Rachel Jackson's divorce proceedings, which revealed that Rachel had lived with Andrew while she was married to another man. The story of Rachel's adultery was soon on the front pages of newspapers across the country.
Jackson is called the Western Bluebeard. Rachel is the American Jezebel, and it's said the touch of a profligate woman like Rachel is going to pollute anyone. How can someone like this be put in the White House and over the women in Washington society?
Jackson blamed Henry Clay for the attacks on Rachel, and he would later say that it was one of the great regrets of his life that he did not shoot Clay.
And he meant it.
Instead, Jackson's campaign fired back with the charge that while Adams was U.S. envoy to Russia, he had procured an American whore for the Russian Tsar.
This and other stories they told about Adams were lies, whereas the story that the Adams people were telling about Jackson was true, but taken together, they all made the campaign of 1828 quite possibly the dirtiest campaign in all American history.
I don't think John Quincy Adams had anything to do with it, but he didn't stop it. So, you know, you're guilty because you didn't stop it. You know, it allowed to happen. But I don't think he himself how do I say it? Man, he's guilty because it happened, but I don't think he did it, or I think he wanted to play stupid on the whole thing. You find it, you leak it, you put it out there, but distance me from it. Which is but yeah.
The viciousness of the
And John Quincy Adams, by the way, was not corrupt in any way. He was a good person. Henry Clay, I don't know. I'm Team Jackson against Henry Clay, but Abraham Lincoln loved him, and I love Lincoln, so that's a rock and a hard place for me.
campaign would have consequences no one could have foreseen. Rachel was now 57 and had become deeply religious. She found it impossible to accept that people across America were now publicly calling her a whore and worse, just because she had fallen in love with Andrew Jackson so many years ago.
Yeah, she's the victim in all that.
To a friend, she wrote,
"Who has been so cruelly tried as I have? Our enemies have dipped their arrows in wormwood and gall and sped them at me. Almighty God, was there ever anything to equal it? To think that 30 years have passed."
I've come to see Rachel Jackson's life as the plot of a grand opera. You have a young woman who makes a mistake in her first marriage and then chooses to escape that with a very courageous protector. But by doing that, she's made perhaps the biggest mistake of her life, because this whole story of Rachel as a fallen woman explodes on the scene again and becomes the moral wedge issue of the 1820 campaigns.
when the election of 18...
It's sad because she gets called a whore and all this. Meanwhile, she married a man who was a drunk and he beat her. So she got away. And she went back, it happened again, she got away. Went back, happened again, got away. She met Andrew Jackson in that period, and he just fell in love with her. He never tried to intervene until she pretty much was done. And then he immediately, as it's covered, they went to the other state, got married. And then the guy used that later on to divorce her and blah, blah, blah. But, he was a terrible person, the first husband. I don't even remember his name. But yet, she's the one who has to catch flack for it 30 years later. It's just a shit thing.
28 was over and the votes were counted. Andrew Jackson, the war hero who had dramatically expanded America, was elected president in a landslide. In January of 1829, he boarded a steamboat to begin his journey from Nashville to Washington, D.C. At many stops along the way, the townsfolk planned joyous celebrations to honor the first man of humble origins to become president. But Andrew Jackson declined every single invitation he received, for he was too bowed down with grief. Just after the election, Rachel Jackson had died of a heart attack.
So the night he won the election, he was told, the night he was told he had won the election, she was so struck with grief because of what had already been said about her. What else are they going to say? And she suffered a heart attack. He stayed with her, tried to get her to feel better, I think a couple weeks, and then either hit again or she had a stroke, but either way, it eventually killed her. And I know I was cheering. I was cheering because he won, and then I immediately remembered, oh yeah, and that happens. So I wasn't cheering for her. I was cheering for him, but him winning. So, yeah.
Jackson was devastated by Rachel's death. From that day forward, he carried her miniature and would speak to Rachel every night before he went to sleep, whether he was at the Hermitage or in Washington. And when he was home at the Hermitage, each evening he would go and visit Rachel's grave.
And yet, Rachel's death was seen by some as a political godsend for Jackson.
Everyone around Jackson knows Rachel is going to be a problem in the White House because the women in Washington will not accept her socially. And Rachel choosing, shall we say, to die at that moment frees him to focus on all the challenges he'll have in the White House. And in many ways, she's like Madame Butterfly, who realizes that it's only through her death that she'll be able to give her lover what he needs.
But that was not how Andrew Jackson saw it. In his eyes, his enemies had made an unforgivable attack on his wife.
He blamed John Quincy Adams for not putting a stop to it, and he blamed Henry Clay for initiating it. Jackson actually believed that they killed her. And so, as far as he was concerned, they were her murderers.
Over the next 8 years, Jackson's anger at his enemies would combine with his passionate personality and strong convictions to produce one of the most turbulent presidencies America has ever experienced.
I think it's a good time right there to end it. I mean, I could go another 24 seconds, but it was a great little thing. We'll end it there. Yeah, I feel bad for her dying. Was it a god? I don't know if it was a godsend. Would she have been welcomed in the circles? Who cares? Who cares what those other gossiping seagull face women? Who gives a shit what they think? They could have made it difficult for her, but she could have always relied on the fact that, oh yeah, you're gossiping about me. Just remember though, I am the first lady, and you're not. You're just some hens. So, all right, I'm gonna end this here. This is part 4. Come back with part 5. And we're going to end this in 6,401,000